Good evening. I'm delighted that you've chosen to join us for the reading of this play, The Mythmakers, the story of the creative friendship of C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. You know, for the past 20 or 25 years or so, I've been on a joyful journey, a spiritual pilgrimage of sorts, writing and rewriting this script, enlarging the plot. For instance, I felt it necessary to include both Joy and Edith, the wife of Lewis and the wife of Tolkien. They're women that I imagine to be very delightful, and every bit their husbands' creative equals. I've had a lot of fun with this play, but it's also been spiritually enlightening. I hope it is for you. The format that we're using this evening is a table reading. It's a theatrical tool that's employed in Hollywood and theaters everywhere, whereby actors are brought around a table, acquainting themselves with each other for the first time and acquainting themselves with the larger script, hoping to begin to generate some chemistry, the kind of chemistry that's necessary for the making of a play. We're using that format this evening for a lot of reasons, but primarily for practical purposes. We have a most amazing cast, as you will discover, but they are, by and large, gifted amateurs, folks who have their own jobs, who have so many other things to do as well. Thus, we've had very little time to rehearse, very little time to practice. What you see tonight is a first-time shoot with very little editing. But I think you'll get into the story, and my hope and my prayer is that the story will get into you. I am very grateful for this cast. They are an amazing group of people. And I'm grateful for Lance Mays, who did all the production work. We've had a lot of fun making this particular production, and we hope you have as much fun watching it. Well, enough said. Curtains up, The Mythmakers.
Welcome to Mythmakers. Scene 1. The curtain is raised to reveal the rabbit room at the Eagle and the Child, a pub in Oxford, England. Edmund Clarke, a middle-aged man dressed in an overcoat, black suit, and hat, enters.
This seems the appropriate place to be on this dreary morning. I've just been to the funeral mass for my friend and mentor, J.R.R. Tolkien. And as you would expect, I'm afraid that my spirit reflects this dismal weather. I felt this to be just the place to sort out my thoughts. It's a holy of holies for me. It's a thin place where just so many things within my imagination were baptized into a whole world of myth. It was here that I was introduced to enchanted places like Narnia and Middle-earth. It was here that some of the brightest minds of this or any generation gathered. Professors like Neville Coggle, Hugo Dyson, the gentle physician Robert Harvard, lawyer Owen Barfield, and writer Charles Williams. Also here was the retired military officer Warren Lewis, who was such an unassuming soul that you wouldn't have noticed him, much less recognized that he was a gifted author in his own right. Warnie, as he was known by all of us, preferred to stay in his brother's shadow, and his brother did cast a huge shadow, literally and figuratively.
Clarke pauses with a smile.
His brother was none other than C.S. Lewis, the famous Oxford professor known by his close friends as Jack. Of course, he was parodied by his students and others in the Oxford community who referred to him as Heavy Lewis because of his weight and his intellect. It's a pity they didn't know him better. Granted, Jack could be intellectually intimidating, never allowing for shoddy thinking or unsubstantiated pronouncements. But his bark was always worse than his bite. He simply took his work and his students very seriously. He loved mornings where he could enjoy his beer and the brotherhood. He particularly enjoyed regaling us with jokes and stories. In so many ways, he was the center pole of this tent of intellectual vaudeville. In this mix of merry men, there was another who commanded the same respect as Jack. He didn't demand the spotlight as much as it naturally came to shine upon him. He too was a professor at Oxford and was everything one imagined an Oxford don. Prim, proper, everything. Always highly intellectual. He had an air of precision about him. The clever way he dressed, the articulate way he spoke, and his ever-present sense of appropriateness. In fact, everything about him seemed prescriptive. But lest you think he was an arrogant snob, he was far, far from it. Although the man was brilliant, fluent in a dozen or more languages, he never assumed a sense of superiority. The man, of course, was J.R.R. Tolkien, affectionately known to his friends as Tollers. Of all the men who regularly met here, I'm going to say it was Tollers and Jack who influenced me most. But then that shouldn't be a surprise. I had the good fortune of having them both as teachers and as beloved friends. I remember the first time I met them. And ironically enough, I met them both on the same morning.
Scene 2, the new buildings at Magdalen College. The lights dim and Clarke moves in the dark, putting on the sleeveless, buttonless black cloth gown worn by the Oxford University undergrads.
I had just come up to Oxford where I was to read English literature. The tutor assigned to me was Mr. C.S. Lewis of Magdalen College. I'd gone to visit Mr. Lewis to make my formal introduction and to plan my reading assignment for the upcoming term. I remember walking eagerly along the cloisters looking for Mr. Lewis's staircase. I finally found it and started up. And as I did, I was joined at that exact moment by a slender, distinguished man smoking a pipe.
J.R.R. Tolkien, Tollers, enters.
Are you here to see Mr. Lewis? I didn't think he hosted tutorials in the summer.
Oh no, sir, he doesn't. But I've been assigned to Mr. Lewis, so I've come to formally meet him and receive my assignments for the upcoming term.
Good for you, young man. You are fortunate to have him as your tutor. He is the most reputable scholar and a man unlike any other I have ever known. I realize that you are here for a most important appointment, but would you be so kind as to let me say a word to Mr. Lewis first? I won't be long. I only want to retrieve a manuscript.
Clarke nods in obedient affirmation. They both move towards center stage where they pause at a doorway. Tollers knocks, the door opens, and C.S. Lewis, Jack, appears.
Tollers, is that you? Just the man I wanted to see. I can't wait to discuss your latest chapters. I've had the greatest pleasure in reading them. Can you join me for some lunch in the college?
Tollers nods toward Clarke, who Jack notices for the first time. Looking a bit conflicted, Jack turns to Clarke.
May I help you?
Sir, I'm Edmund Clarke. I wrote you that I would be coming to introduce myself. You've been assigned to be my tutor, and I simply wanted to know what you expected for our first meeting.
Yes. Mr. Clarke, please come in.
As Jack ushers in Clarke, he turns toward Tollers.
Give me a few minutes with this new student, and then we can discuss a bit of, and get lunch and discuss your manuscript.
No hurry. I'll just sit on the bench near Addison's walkway and soak up some of this glorious sunshine.
Tollers exit. Lewis turns to join Clarke. The room reveals Spartan accommodations. Although certainly not dirty, it is not particularly clean. There are several stuffed armchairs surrounding a large Chesterfield sofa placed on a rug. The furniture is well worn and the carpet's color is a dull gray. At the back of the stage is a large bookcase. Jack motions Clarke to take a chair. As he does, he takes a drag on a cigarette that is a collection of ashes on its end, about to fall off.
Come in, Mr. Clarke, and have a seat.
Sir, may I get you an ashtray, Mr. Lewis?
Oh, no bother. I don't use one. We allow the ashes to feed the rug.
Clarke looks confused.
My brother, Warnie, discovered somewhere in his travels that ashes are actually good for rugs.
Clarke continues to look confused.
Tell me, Mr. Clarke, why do you want to read English?
Well, I think English will be an asset to whatever career I may have. But more importantly, I enjoy reading, especially poetry.
Good for you. What poetry do you like?
Oh, quite an assorted few. Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, and of course, Shakespeare.
Have you read any long poems, say Wordsworth's Prelude?
Well, I haven't read that, but I've read his ode, Intimations of Immortality, Shelley's The Revolt of Islam, and the whole of Chesterton's The Ballad of the White Horse.
Ah, good. What could you quote from that?
The great gales of Ireland are the men that made mad.
Jack notices Clarke's growing anxiety and interrupts with great gusto and exclamation, concluding the quote.
For all their wars are merry and all their songs are sad. Marvelous stuff, isn't it? Don't you like the way Chesterton takes hold of you in that poem, shakes you and makes you want to cry? I think the best part of all is the last. The high tide, King Alfred cries. The high tide and the turn, as the tide turns on the tall gray seas. See how they waver in the trees. See how tall their spears, how knock their knees, how wild their watchfires burn.
Jack pauses, almost mentally wandering somewhere else, then catches himself and continues.
Let's get down to business. I want you to read Chaucer, focusing primarily on his Canterbury Tales, but by all means, don't read the literary critics, read Chaucer. In addition, you must become proficient in the Anglo-Saxon primer. You can find a copy at Blackwell's. If you do your work and I do mine, we have much to learn together.
Suddenly, Jack stands up, backing Clarke out of the room.
I look forward to seeing you in the fall, Mr. Clarke.
Well, yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Clarke stumbles out, encountering Tollers again, who is sitting on a bench enjoying the sun.
How did you get on?
To tell you the truth, I'm not sure. He is a most intimidating man. I don't know what to make of him exactly, but if anything, he promises to be an interesting tutor.
Interesting? Oh, yes, he's certainly that. You'll never get to the bottom of him.
Lights dim as Clarke walks back to center stage.
And Tollers was right. I never did get to a full understanding of that man. He had what could only be described as a daunting intellect. So much so that for most of that first term, I was terrified of him. I remember the tutorial when I mustered the courage to be honest with him, confessing my intimidation by him as a teacher and as a person.
Jack and Clarke are sitting in Jack's living room. They are facing one another, the proper position for a tutor and his student, with Jack sitting on the sofa and Clarke perched on the edge of one of the chairs.
Mr. Lewis, thank you for your valuable insights on my paper. Mr. Lewis, I feel compelled to tell you something.
And what might that be, Mr. Clarke?
I've been meeting with you for 2 terms now, and I find that I'm still uncomfortable around you.
You don't say.
I do say, you're the most intimidating man I have ever known.
Really? Why would you say that, Mr. Clarke?
Well, for one thing, it's your manner. You seem ready to pounce on any mistake I have made, written or spoken, whether I am here in a tutorial or even on the street.
Elaborate.
Okay, do you remember last week when we were walking toward Blackwell's and a couple of tourists engrossed in their maps bumped into us? I muttered something about blessed tourists, and right away you took me to task on my expression, inquiring what I meant by blessed and whether or not I knew the meaning of the word. And without so much as looking over at me, you said, I suspect what you really meant was damn tourist. Just the opposite of what you actually said. Then, enjoying yourself, you quipped, certainly you didn't hope that they were now exceedingly blessed and that they presently will enjoy the bliss of the celestial realms.
Surely you don't expect me to be your nanny, Mr. Clarke. It is my job to teach you the serious discipline of learning, and education, my dear sir, isn't accumulating bits of knowledge so that you can land a good job. No, education is teaching you how to think, and that, I hope, doesn't happen just 1 hour a week when you are here with me.
Well, no, sir. I don't mean to be impertinent, but it's just that you always seem so prepared. It's as if you already know what I'm going to say before I even say it. How can anyone compete with that?
Mr. Clarke, we aren't competing in these tutorials. We are learning together. I am simply trying to offer you what I have learned and in the manner in which I have learned it.
Well, but okay, I just have to ask you, do you really have all this knowledge committed to memory, or is there just some kind of trick to all this?
Jack raises an eyebrow and lights a cigarette.
Mr. Clarke, be so kind as to give me a number between 1 and 10.
A number?
Yes, go with it.
Okay, 9.
Fine. Now, go to the 9th shelf on the first bookcase over there.
Jack points in the direction of his bookshelves at the back of the room. Clarke moves to the bookshelf, looking uncertain about what is to transpire.
So, okay, you want me to go to the bookshelf, and then what?
Yes, now give me another number from 1 to 20.
14?
All right. Take the 14th book off the shelf. Don't let me see the book. Now, give me a number from 1 to 100.
Well, all right. 46.
Now turn to page 46.
Clarke dutifully complies.
Give me one more number, this time 1 to 25 for the line of the page in the book.
18.
So read me that line.
Now while the birds thus sing a joyous song.
One of my favorites, Wordsworth's imitations of immortality and the young lambs bound to the tabor's sound.
My God, it's true. You do remember everything.
I do recall quite a lot, but it's not so much an achievement. I was born with it. I can remember nearly everything I've read, but I am horrible with dates and time.
Jack pauses and motions for Clarke to sit down again.
Mr. Clarke, it's not so much what you know, it's what you do with what you know. Besides, there are sometimes gaps in the old memory bank. Thus, I am a bit reluctant to trust my memory for everything. For instance, after I completed writing the Oxford History of English Literature, I couldn't sleep for worrying that I had missed a footnote or quote that some other scholar might catch and critique someday.
Has anybody found anything?
Well, thanks goodness, no. But I still dream about it. Clarke, you are a good man with a bright future. I don't consider myself over you. Rather, you have come to read with me. Forgive me if I have treated you otherwise. I truly believe in this shared endeavor, and I hope that my character is being developed along with yours. Trust me, Clarke, we both have a lot to learn.
With that, Jack stands to end the tutorial.
I do have an assignment for you, one that I think you will enjoy. Do you remember the gentleman you met when you first came to my rooms? His name is J.R.R. Tolkien, and I want you to attend his lecture this week. He's doing Beowulf, and I can promise you it will be extraordinary. Professor Tolkien is one remarkable scholar. He has the rare ability to pay attention to the language of poetry and to the poetry of language. He reveals not only what words mean, but why the poet chose those particular words. It is fascinating and insightful. Mr. Tolkien speaks several languages fluently and, in addition, has invented 2 or 3 languages of his own. He may be the brightest man in all of Oxford. You won't want to miss one who very well may be a living legend. And the great thing is he doesn't even know it.
Jack catches himself as if to remind Clarke of something.
I should warn you, Mr. Tolkien is difficult to follow because he clips his words and speaks rapidly. If it were a normal lecture, I would suggest that you sit close to the front, just to hear everything. But you won't have to worry about that with his Beowulf lecture. The good professor becomes quite animated, bringing life to words that are centuries old. You are free to go, Mr. Clarke.
Oh, thank you, sir. And thank you for everything.
Scene 4, Oxford University, Examination Hall. Tollers walks in with his professorial robe flowing behind him and moves with graceful intention to a lectern.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are here this evening to hear one of the great treasures of English literature, Beowulf. I would like for you to join me in being mesmerized by the sheer genius of its poetry. Too often, I'm afraid, scholars would rather dissect the poem, critiquing the text, postulating the content, and assessing the character of the author, who in this case is, well, anonymous. However, poetry wasn't meant to be taken apart, but rather to be experienced. Why, the opening lines of this epic poem have the power to call us together in imaginative ways. The spear Danes in Danes gone by, and the kings who ruled them had courage and greatness. We have heard of those princes' heroic campaigns.
Paul stops abruptly. He looks over his audience pensively.
Those words in modern day English are magical. However, I think the power of the masterpiece is found in the hearing it in its original language. Thus, may I present to you a reading of Beowulf in its original Anglo-Saxon dialect. My hope is that you not only appreciate the language, but you will experience its spirit. Thuit way gardena in geargadum, de suninga, thirum gefrunen, who thought aisling eling framadon.
Mr. Lewis was right. Professor Tolkien was magnificent. He turned that lecture room into a mead hall in which he was the bard and we were all his feasting, listening guests. Over the years, his Beowulf lectures became legendary at Oxford, a stir that packed lecture halls whenever they were scheduled. And Mr. Lewis would know all about this kind of popularity. After all, he was the consummate speaker. His lectures were all well attended, usually producing standing room only crowds. But all his lectures, none was as much anticipated or better received than his initial lecture at Cambridge. The hall was filled to capacity, with some even sitting on the windowsills.
Scene 5. Cambridge University Lecture Room. Jack enters the room and takes his place at the podium.
Speaking from a newly founded chair, I find myself freed from one embarrassment only to fall into another. I have no great predecessors to overshadow me. On the other hand, I must try, as the theatrical people say, to create the part. The responsibility is heavy. If I miscarry, the university might come to regret not only my election, but that which matters very much more, the foundation of the chair itself. That is why I have thought it best to take the bull by the horns and devote this lecture to explaining as clearly as I can the way in which I approach my work, my interpretation of the commission you have given me.
Jack continues his lecture as the spotlight dims on him, but comes up on Clarke, stage left.
Mr. Lewis waxed on eloquently, recalibrating history as was then known, and speaking of the need to return to the fundamentals of language and literature, as old-fashioned as that might seem.
And yet, is that the whole story? If a live dinosaur dragged its slow length into the laboratory, would we not all look back as we fled? What a chance to know at last how it really moved and smelled and looked, and what noises it made. One thing I know, I would give a great deal to hear any ancient Athenian, even a stupid one, talking about Greek tragedy. He would know in his bones so much that we seek in vain. At any moment, some chance phrase might, unknown to him, show us where modern scholarship has been on the wrong track for years. Ladies and gentlemen, I stand before you somewhat as that Athenian might stand. I read as a native text that which you must read, I am sorry to say, as foreigners. You see why I said that the claim was not really arrogant. Who can be proud of speaking fluently his mother tongue, or knowing his way about his father's house? Therefore, where I may fail as a critic, I may be useful as a specimen. I would even dare to go further, speaking not only for myself, but all other old Western men whom you may meet. I would rather say, use your specimens while you can. There are not going to be many more dinosaurs.
Scene 6. The Rabbit Room. Clarke is seated at a table.
Mr. Lewis was right. He and Professor Tolkien were a vanishing breed. Academically, few have followed with the disciplined clarity of their work. But more importantly, as brilliant as they were as academicians, had it not been for their friendship, we very possibly might never have been the beneficiaries of their imaginative genius, which will last longer than any of their lectures. It is strange that they should have become friends in the first place. After all, academia is not known as being the most conducive environment for friendship. Acquaintances, perhaps, but not friendship. Friendship requires openness and vulnerability. That rarely happens in academia, where criticism and political jockeying are the warp and woof of intellectual life. Ironically enough, it was at an academics meeting of the English faculty that they actually met.
We were at one of those dreadful faculty meetings required for members of the English faculty. One of those meetings which were more political than they were than any of the haggling that goes along in Parliament. The issue before us was the nature of the syllabus, whether we were going to emphasize literature or linguistics. Along with myself, most of the professors in the room were biased toward the literature side of the argument. There was little opposition until Mr. Tolkien stood to speak. I remember thinking that he was a smooth, pale, fluent chap who was passionate about linguistics. As I recall, the matter was discussed for an hour or so and, as usual, didn't reach any conclusion. Afterward, I approached Mr. Tolkien in the hopes of being sociable. I asked him what he thought of Spenser. He said he couldn't read Spenser because of the forms. The forms? Ah! He launched into his belief that language was the real thing in education, that all literature was written for the amusement of men between 30 and 40. He went on to say that his pet abomination was the idea of liberal studies. Technical hobbies were more of his line. No harm in him, I thought. He only needed a smack or two. Obviously, we did not hit it off right away. After all, from my earliest recollections, I had been warned from my Irish Protestant childhood never to trust a Catholic. And when I became a member of the English faculty, I had been warned never to trust a philologist. Tolkien was both. A few days later, he bumped into me at the Bodleian Library. I've often wondered whether or not the meeting was on purpose, whatever. He said to me,
I'm a bit surprised with your stance on the syllabus. Because of your love of classical language, I would have thought that you would have been an advocate for the importance of linguistics. Original languages and their evolution do matter to you, don't they?
I looked at him and nodded my head, and then he set the hook in me.
Listen, I have a group gathering to read Norse mythology together in the original language. Would you be interested?
How did he know of my fascination with Norse mythology? And what was his purpose in asking me to join his group? I never asked whether he was setting me up, and he never told me. It didn't matter.
What did matter was that this shared interest became the catalyst for our friendship.
As so often happens at the beginning of a friendship, a common interest brings people together. This particular common bond forged a deep friendship between these two, one that changed not only their destinies, but the way so many of us now see the world. I suppose it would be fair to say that individually they would have been successes in their respective fields of academia, writing esoteric works for the academy. It was their shared friendship that gave them the freedom to go places that academia would never have allowed. It was their coming together that sparked a serendipitous discovery of imagination like the world has never seen. I've often pondered if their visions of other worlds would ever been articulated without the encouragement of each other. It all started over lunch one day at the Eastgate Hotel, when Tollers took the risk of sharing with Jack what he had been up to in a private hobby of his.
Jack and Tollers, scene 7, the Eastgate Hotel dining room. They're sitting together at a table, finishing the lunch. Tollers looks around as if to see if anyone is watching, then reaches into his briefcase and retrieves a manuscript.
Jack, There is a side of me that no one outside my family knows about. As a hobby, I dabble in writing fantasy stories. I've never shared them with anyone except my wife and children, but I have something that I've been working on for some time and would like to get a professional opinion. Your opinion. I've written a few lines to speak of a kingdom I've invented.
Tollers hesitates, but then begins reading from the manuscript.
There once and long ago, before the sun and moon we know were lit to sail the world, when first the shaggy woods unfurled, and shadowy shapes did stare and roam beneath that dark and starry dome, that hung above the dawn of earth. The silence with silver mirth were shaken, and the rocks were ringing. The birds of Melian were singing.
Tollers looks up to read Jack's reaction, but seeing no visible expression, he presses on.
I realize we don't have time for me to read over the whole thing right now, but could I trouble you to take a look at it and tell me if you think it has any worth?
Tollers, you are the most unusual man I know, but unusual in such creative ways. I don't mind at all reading your story, but I have one bit of hesitation. Some of my students claim that I can be unduly harsh in critiquing their work. Then again, you are an Oxford professor extremely familiar with the give and take of critical debate. Let me take a look at it and give it a going over.
Tollers uneasily passes the manuscript over to Jack.
Critiquing someone's work is not an easy thing to do, especially if that someone is a good friend. I mean, this manuscript is his baby, and who wants to be told that his baby is ugly?
Scene 8. Jack's sitting room, Magdalen College, and Toller's home study. Jack is sitting at his desk, stage left, reading Toller's manuscript. Jack puts the manuscript down, beaming like a proud father.
I was not just relieved at what I had read. The truth was, I was enraptured.
Jack begins to write.
My dear Tolkien, just a line to say, I sat up last night reading your guest as far as to where Beren and his gnomish allies defeat the patrol of orcs. I can honestly say it is ages since I have had an evening of such delight, and the personal interest of reading a friend's work had little to do with it. I should have enjoyed it just as well if I picked it up in a bookshop by an unknown author. I am truly enjoying it, so much at the first blush. Detailed criticisms, including grumbles at individual lines, will follow. Yours, C.S. Lewis.
The light dims and moves to Tollers, who is at his desk, stage right, opening and then reading Jack's letter.
Jack's letter sent my spirits soaring, but I still was anxious about the detailed criticisms which were to follow. I shouldn't have worried, but that's my nature.
The lights dim on Tollers and come up again on Jack, who is at his desk, reflecting, staring at the blank paper in front of him. He looks at the audience.
I wanted to be careful how I responded to Tollers. He wasn't one of my students, he was a friend. And given the tentative fashion in which he shared his poem with me, I did not want to come across as unduly harsh.
Again, the lights dim on Jack and come up on Tollers, who is working quickly at his desk, holding another envelope with a letter from Jack. He looks up from his reading.
I was stunned with delight at Jack's critique. With his dramatic, imaginative flair, he treated my little tale as if it were already a treasured piece of ancient literature, being criticized by a group of scholarly experts. He named his made-up scholarly experts Peabody, Pumpernickel, Schuffer, and Schick. Through these characters. He offered commentary on the text, but using, well, exaggerated academic jargon that had mimicking tones to each voice.
The spotlight comes up on Jack, still at his desk writing.
Peabody observes of this whole passage the combination of extreme simplicity with convincing truth of psychology. Pumpernickel interrupts. The latest redactors were always needlessly amplifying, as if the imagination of their readers could do nothing for itself, and thus blunting the true force and energy of the guest. Schoeffer says confidently, my own conclusion is that if the assonance in the textus receptus is correct, the same phenomenon must have originally occurred often and have been suppressed elsewhere by the scribes.
The spotlight dims and comes up again on Tollers, who is laughing out loud.
Jack spent an inordinate amount of time giving me the criticism I so desperately wanted to hear. And, well, he gave it with such gentle creativity. Why, he nearly spent as much time in his inventive critique as I did writing the piece in the first place.
Tollers picks up the letter and continues to read. The spotlight dims on him and comes up again on Jack.
Of course, Tollers didn't take all of my suggestions. He seldom did. However, I do think he enjoyed my enthusiastic insights. What's more, I think we discovered something that became an important part of our friendship. You see, sharing one's work is so vital in the creative process. Imaginative work requires a trust in oneself that is virtually impossible to sustain alone. I think I gave that to Tollers, and he most certainly returned the favor.
Scene 9. The rabbit room. Jack and Tollers are huddled over a table in the rabbit room, sharing beers and conversation.
Tollers, may I request a favor from you?
What's that, Jack?
Would you mind reading out loud that piece you wrote about Baron meeting Luthien?
Most certainly, but I find it, well, fascinating that you enjoy hearing things read out loud.
I don't know why I enjoy that so much either. Other than it's just a remnant of the time when my mother used to read to me. These days, it gives me the opportunity to hear your words as they paint pictures in my mind.
Tollers smiles, shuffles through his briefcase, finds the paper, and begins.
Ah, Luthien, Tinville, why wentest thou to darkling dell, with shining eyes and dancing pace, the twilight glimmering in thy face? Each day before the end of eve, she sought her love, nor would him leave, until the stars were dimmed, and day became glimmering eastward silver gray. Then trembling veiled she would appear, and dance before him, half in fear. There flitting just before his feet, she gently chid with laughter sweet, "Come, dance now, Baron, dance with me."
Tollers pauses and looks up at Jack.
Tollers, I find it so amazing to discover this side of you. Even though you have this great ability for linguistics, at heart, you are a romanticist. How in the world did you come up with this tender love scene?
The truth is that it was inspired by my wife, Edith.
Jack doesn't say anything, but wears an expression so as to invite Tollers to say more.
Edith and I were both orphans. My brother and I had been placed under the care of the Catholic Church, specifically a wonderful priest by the name of Father Francis Morgan. He had been our guardian ever since Mother died. Father Morgan took meticulous care of my brother and me, placing us in various homes. Finally, he placed us in the home of Mrs. Faulkner, a woman who took in orphans and other boarders from time to time.
Scene 10, the Faulkner home in Birmingham. A girl, Edith, is playing the piano. The spotlight falls on Tollers, center stage, and follows him as he moves to engage her.
I think I fell in love with her at first sight. She had the most captivating, beautiful eyes and captivating smile.
Tollers sheepishly approaches Edith.
You play rather well.
Do you play?
Why, no.
Then how would you know how well I play?
I can't play, but I can hear.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to be rude.
I didn't take it that way. I'm Ronald Tolkien, and along with my brother, I have come to live here.
I know. Mrs. Faulkner told me all about you.
All about me?
Well, not all. She just mentioned that you were coming to live here.
I hope that we might become friends.
We'll see.
It wasn't long before we began seeing each other as more than mere house guests. We went on walks in the woods, and our conversations about the future began being punctuated with the glorious pronoun hour.
We would meet for tea in the afternoon and play silly games with each other, such as tossing sugar cubes down on the hats of unsuspecting walkers below.
We became so enthralled with each other that we couldn't go to bed at night without saying good night to each other. Good night, Edith.
Good night, Ronald. We were in love, and we both knew it. Unfortunately, others began to know it as well.
I was summoned in to see Father Morgan, who informed me that he had become aware that I was spending an inordinate amount of time with Edith. He wasn't pleased with the fact that she was an Anglican. In fact, he commanded me to stop seeing her and focus my attention on getting into Oxford. I objected, but he was firm in his decision. I did as Father Francis instructed. After all, he was not only my priest and my governor, he was the father figure I never had.
I didn't understand the abruptness of it at all, and the seeming finality. Ronald told me that he loved me, but that he had to obey Father Morgan's orders to stop seeing me or even communicating with me until he had turned 21. Consequently, he left, and I thought I would never see him again.
I went to Exeter College at Oxford, where I immersed myself in the study of the classics, Old English and other languages. And I worked hard at my studies and was on track to finish when my 21st birthday approached. It was a day I had longed for because it was the end of Father Morgan's prescribed isolation. I simply had to get in touch with Edith, but that wasn't easy. She had moved from Birmingham. Finally, I was able to track her down in Cheltenham. I wrote her a letter declaring my love for her. I even asked her to marry me.
I was surprised to receive Ronald's letter. I thought he had forgotten me. After all, it had been 3 years since I had heard from him. I wrote him back to tell him that, thinking that he had gone other directions with his life. I had become engaged.
When I received Edith's reply, I wired her immediately, telling her that I was coming to see her on Friday morning. We simply had to talk face to face.
Scene 11. The tea house in Cheltenham. Tollers is waiting nervously for Edith. She enters and he approaches her quickly, but they are both cautious.
Edith, words are inadequate to describe how good it is to see you.
It is nice to see you, Ronald.
Is this a good place to talk? Maybe we could ask to sit on the balcony.
Tollers smiles, hoping Edith will pick up on the memory.
That would be fine, but they do not allow the tossing of sugar cubes.
They both relax. Tollers takes her by the arm. They sit at a nearby table.
Ronald, I don't know why you think you can leave me and not say one word to me for 3 years and then show up here asking me to marry you.
Edith, I couldn't help it. I had to keep my word with Father Morgan.
And yet, just like that, you want me to go back on my word? Doesn't that seem a bit inconsistent and uncaring to you?
Edith, I know about you every day for the past 3 years. I have never stopped loving you.
Well, you could have said so.
I was bound by that oath to abstain from writing. Besides, I'm saying so now. Don't you still love me?
I don't know. I thought I'd put you out of my mind. But now,
So you'll give me a second chance? It would make me the happiest man in the world.
I returned the ring that weekend. A few weeks later, Ronald and I formally announced our engagement in Birmingham.
I was deliriously happy and almost walked on air back to Oxford, where I poured myself into my studies, graduating with first-class honors.
Ronald was not the only one studying. I began taking classes that would lead me into the Catholic Church, much to the dismay of many people. There was so much animosity between Catholics and Protestants in those days. My landlord, a devout Protestant, upon hearing of my decision to convert to Catholicism, immediately asked me to leave. It was the first of a lifelong struggle I've had with religion, with people on both sides of the debate who are so adamant that they won't listen to anything but their own argument.
We were married in the Catholic Church. It was the happiest day of my life. My only regret was that Father Morgan was not available to do the ceremony because of his schedule. I would have cherished his participation, but we were forced to move forward. The war was upon us, and I was about to be called up for active duty. And sure enough, it wasn't long before I was called into the war at the Battle of the Somme.
I lived in fear during those days. So many men were dying. I panicked with each knock of the door, fearing the possibility of tragic news about Ronald.
The gruesome aspects of battle had taken away any mystique I may have had about war. The sight of so many dead and bloated bodies provided a grotesque anesthesia that numbed one to the horrors being inflicted. What's more, life in the trenches was dreadful. It was hard to eat or sleep due to the inundation of lice, and there was no remedy for keeping the nasty creatures away. Eventually, I developed a severe bout of trenches disease, which was so bad that I was shipped home.
I finally did receive a knock on the door that I had so much anxiety about. An officer delivered the news that Ronald was severely ill and had been transferred back to England. Fortunately, I found him and was able to be with him as he recovered.
I did begin to heal, and having Edith with me was the best possible medicine. Soon I began to feel well enough to start writing again. It was there that I began to develop my ideas about the beginning of the English history and stories. After a month or two, I was released to home because of the recurring nature of that infernal disease. The bright side to all of this was being able to be with Edith.
Scene 12. English countryside. Edith and Tollers enter, walking hand in hand through the forest when they reach a clearing.
It is so good to be outside. I love walking in these woods, and I love walking with you.
I am the fortunate one to be alive, to be married to you. Edith, does it seem to you that these woods have a certain enchantment?
Edith breaks free from Tollers and begins to hum a beautiful tune in which she begins to dance all the time. Keeping her eyes on Tollers, she continues to dance off stage as lights dim. Scene 13, the rabbit room. Tollers and Jack are still at their table. Tollers shuffles the papers as Jack looks on, mystified.
It was that experience that inspired the image of an immortal elf marrying a mortal man.
Tollers, you are a helpless romantic only one dressed in academic clothing. And your Edith. She appears to be Luthian, sure enough.
She is a wonderful wife and mother. I am blessed. However, she hasn't taken to academia. She doesn't have the time or the inclination to discuss my writing, and she finds the wives of other professors to be tedious, stilted creatures of a social world that has, well, no appeal for her.
I trust you realize you are fortunate to be married to a woman who keeps you tethered to reality.
Tollers looks down and in horror sees his watch.
Oh, my heavens, I didn't realize it was so late.
Scene 14. Toller's home. Tollers rushes in the door of his home only to be greeted by an irate Edith.
Do you have any idea what time it is? Have you no consideration for your family? Where have you been?
I've been with Jack discussing my writing.
And drinking beer and telling lewd stories.
We were not telling lewd stories.
I don't know what you see in that man. He always looks like he sleeps in his clothes, and he carries with him a pervasive aroma of tobacco and beer. And that loud voice of his is like a frigate bullhorn. If he is an example of an English gentleman, then our world is going to hell in a handbasket. And the worst part of him is that he seems to have little, if any, knowledge of or sympathy for anyone with a family. I don't like him. I don't like what he is doing to us.
Well, he would certainly be appalled to hear that. Why, just tonight he told me that I had a most remarkable wife.
Do you think I can believe that?
I would hope you could, because it's true.
Well, look in on your children, will you? They missed seeing you tonight.
Scene 15. Eastgate Hotel dining room. Tollers and Jack are huddled over a table quietly discussing literature. Tollers turns to the audience.
For the longest time, Jack was my primary audience, but what an audience he was. Only from him did I ever get the idea that my stuff could be more than a private hobby. For instance, Jack was the first adult critic who received my Hobbit story, and it was his unabashed enthusiasm that pushed it forward.
Tollers goes back to his reading, and Jack turns to the audience.
And let it be said that Tollers did the same for me. He not only began to review some of my poems, but more than that, he altered my philosophic stance in a dramatic way that changed me and my writing forever.
It happened on one of those walks they took together. Jack loved walking, and Toller sometimes joined him. When he did, Jack would usually ask me to come along. You see, Jack and his brother Warnie were serious walkers, what Jack described as Cretaceous perambulators. They moved purposefully ahead, intent on getting from point A to point B in as little time as possible, with both points being pubs, of course. Jack once commented that there should be a walking tour map that charted all the beer pubs in England. However, Tollers had a different way of walking, one much more pedantic and reflective. For instance, he would stop and peer at vegetation for minutes on end. This drove Jack crazy. He would barge on, leaving me to bring Tollers later. Nevertheless, meaningful conversations took place on those walks. Such was the case one evening at Magdalen College.
Scene 16. Magdalen College dining hall. The Tollers, Clarke, and Jack are sitting at the high table eating by candlelight.
I am grateful for your presence this evening. Sitting at the high table in this dining hall can easily become a stuffy and pretentious affair. I know I don't have to worry about that when you two are here.
It's nice to have an evening of culture, but it is a bit like being in a cultural zoo, unsure of which side of the bars you're on.
Well, let's get out of here before the zookeeper comes and locks us in. How about stretching our legs on Addison's walkway?
Scene 17, Addison's Walkway. Tollers, Jack, and Clarke begin to walk around Addison's Walk, a beautiful tree-shaded path along the river Sharwell.
There is something holy about being outdoors. It grants a clarity to thinking that one can rarely find elsewhere.
Oh, Tollers, I agree with you. Being outdoors offers a certain degree of enchantment, especially walking in a wood on a dark night.
I don't want to break the mood, but Tollers, you mentioned something at dinner that made me want to ask you about how you became so infatuated with language in the first place.
I can remember the exact moment when this interest struck me. I was outdoors. My brother and I were playing in a field when our play was interrupted by a train's whistle, signaling its imminent arrival. We both hit the ground lying on a berm as we watched a locomotive engine pulling a long line of cars. What caught my attention was the words on the sides of the cars. They were all Welsh, a language that I didn't know at that time. As they passed, I tried to phonetically sound them out, wondering where those words came from and what they meant. Right then and there, my linguistic education began.
Wait, all because of a train?
More precisely, the words on the train. Of course, my mother was a big influence. She too had a love for languages and taught me Latin, Greek, and French even before I began my formal education.
Little did she know how hostile your feelings would become one day against the French.
one of life's rich ironies, I would suggest.
Ironic, yes, but what a wonderful gift. Tollers, just think how your mother has blessed you with this knowledge, first in your studies, then with your first job at the Oxford Dictionary Office, and now here at the university.
It has been a lifelong gift, most certainly. As you well know by now, I believe that no word is arbitrary or accidental. Words not only give life, but have life. Thus, philology is the basis for all literature, and for that matter, all knowledge.
Well, wait. That's a rather strong presumption, even for you, don't you think?
You and I look at the Cherwell and call it a river. But why do we call it that? Why we don't think twice about it? But the first person to talk of rivers or trees or any other creation of nature saw these things not as inanimate objects, but living things all yoked together in a cosmic way. To them, the whole of creation was an integrated myth. Thus, in tracing the history of a word, you get back to a history of the people. It is very much akin to an archaeological dig. You go through certain strata, certain changes, and finally arrive at the word's beginning point. If you go back far enough, you can begin to understand where the words came from, and in so doing, discover the sources of the deep myths of that people.
But what does that do really? It's not that I underestimate the power of myth. Listening to you and Barfield has shown me how vital mythology is in deciphering the language and history of a people. What's more, you also know how captivated I am with mythology as a literary genre. But as good as those stories are, even though myths may be poetically described as being breathed through silver, they are still lies.
They are not lies.
But what about those stories of dying gods? I mean, you mean to tell me that you believe all of those stories of Balder and Adonis are true?
Okay, let me just jump in here. I do believe these stories are true, not so much in a factual sense, but they're stories which point to a deeper, ultimate truth.
Clarke is right about this, Jack. The pagan myths we love so dearly are God's expressions through the minds of the poets. And the Christian myth is exactly the same, with one enormous difference. The poet whose creativity was at work was none other than God. And the images were real men and actual history.
I have a hard time believing that. I can't imagine how something that happened 2,000 years ago has any relevance for me today.
Okay, try this. Let me ask you something. When you were reading Balder or Adonis, did you ask if the story was factual? No, you simply enjoyed the story. You received something from those stories that you could not be given from abstract argument. Your senses were so involved that you drew nourishment in ways that you could never find in a syllogism or a list of abstruse truths.
Jack, Edmund is right. Perhaps your issue with all of this has to do with the fact that you compartmentalize your thoughts about Christianity. Your questions of faith are confined to the philosophical realm. I would hope that you would use your imaginative genius with what you call the Christian myth. Can't you see that Christianity is like all other myths, with one enormous exception? It is real. It is the ultimate truth that all other myths live out of.
Gentlemen, as much as I admire and respect you, I still don't know if I can buy all of that.
Just as Jack says this, a rush of wind blows through Addison Walk's scattering leaves.
I suppose we've riled the spirits in this place.
Well, either that or it's about to storm.
Let's go back to my room. I have an excellent brandy.
Oh my, it's getting late. I need to get home. There may be a storm billowing on the outside, but it will be pale in comparison to the storm that may be brewing in my bedroom.
They all laugh, and Tollers breaks away.
I'll take you up on that brandy, Jack, but let's be swift or we'll get drenched.
Scene 18. Toller's study. Tollers is hunched over his typewriter, typing out a poem using only 2 fingers to do so.
The heart of man is not compound of lies, but draws some wisdom from the only wise, and still recalls him, though now long estranged. Man is not wholly lost, nor wholly changed.
Scene 19. A day or so later, Jack's study. Jack is looking over his mail, finds a piece from Tollers. He opens it and begins reading. Looking up, he turns to the audience.
I received Toller's poem by post and wept upon reading it. Tollers did what great poets can do. He made me slow down and ponder the elegance of creation. He so majestically captured our conversation of the previous evening. In his own penetrating way, he conveyed the meaning that all good stories evolve out of the one true story, the story of a God who delights in our stories. In fact, this pleasure calls forth the Creator in all of us to let the story go on and on. I wasn't exactly sure at the time. I know now that experience marked a turning point in my life. Our walk that evening made me think about faith in ways I never had before. I began to see myth in a breathtakingly new light, both in a poetic and spiritual sense. And like a good myth, I began to know that in my heart as well as my head, Toller's poem captured not only the essence of our conversation, but it had the hue of golden truth and beauty.
Scene 20. The rabbit room. Clarke is seated in his chair, nursing his beard.
You know, I heard Jack mention that walk on several occasions. It really did change his life. In addition, the result of that walk brought Jack and Tollers closer. They continued their Monday ritual of meeting at the East Gate, but they also formed a writing group, the Inklings, which met in Jack's rooms on Thursday evening.
Scene 21. Jack's sitting room. Maudlin. Jack, Clarke, Warnie, Warren Lewis, Jack's older brother, and Tollers are seated facing the audience and what would be other Inklings. They're drinking ales and smoking either pipes or cigarettes, emptying their ashes on the rug.
I want to thank you for responding to my invitation this evening. As many of you know, Mr. Tolkien and I have been engaged in a most serious conversation about the direction of our English department. For a couple of years now, professors in the English department have had an ongoing debate over what takes precedence in English studies, literature or grammar. I will admit that at the outset of our conversations, I was very much pro-literature. However, as time has passed and with Mr. Tolkien's helpful wisdom, I have come to see the value of the grammar side of the argument. A major influence in that regard has to do with the history of the language, its own stories, its own myths. That comes through in reading the stories out loud.
The Grimm brothers in Germany learned something about this. In their etymological studies of the German language, they came across wonderful stories that further explained their language and gave mythological insights to their language history.
I know all of us in this room have a high regard for literature and a more than passing interest in writing good literature. Because of that, I thought there might be some attraction in developing a group that gathers to read some of their latest works. Tonight, I've asked Tollers to read from a fairy tale that I find enchanting. After he finishes, we can have a stout or two and discuss it, along with the idea of doing something permanent. Tollers, would you mind in doing us the favor?
I have not settled on a formal title for this story as of yet, but for the time being, let's call it There and Back.
Tollers, opening up his folder, pauses and begins reading.
In a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. Not a nasty, dirty, wet hole, filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort.
The moment was magical. We all leaned in and drank not just our stouts, but from the wonderful atmosphere. The group loved it, and from the responses following, I knew that we had developed something of a permanence, a coterie of literary enthusiasts. We eventually called ourselves, at the suggestion of Tollers, the Inklings, a Middle English term for those who have half-formed intimations and dabble in ink. I had hoped the idea of the group would make, but I was surprised at how much we all enjoyed each other's company, reading together at the college on Thursdays and hoisting a glass or two at the Eagle and the Child on Tuesdays.
Scene 22. The Eastgate dining room. Tollers and Jack are at their normal table.
I am so pleased at the outpouring of praise you were receiving for your hobbit. It is deserving and encouraging, I would think.
I suppose a great deal of that is due to you and your most generous praise of the book in the Times.
I think that the book stands on its own, but I meant every word of it. Your hobbit does belong at the same level of enchanted writing as Carroll, Graham, and even our beloved MacDonald.
Oh, you are too kind. Nevertheless, Jack, I am indebted to you for your generous words, not to mention your encouragement, and all of those hours you listened to my reading it.
That was not a chore for me. I love listening to good stories. Truthfully, I think stories are meant to be heard as well as read. And taking a cue from you, I believe that good words create good mental pictures, and good pictures create deeper understandings.
There is some kind of synergy about it. As I've told you, the Hobbit stories were first told to my children at bedtime. It was only later that they found their way to the page. And now they are let loose in the world to create all kinds of pictures. Yet, it does thrill me to know of your magnanimous encouragement. And honestly, Jack, I don't know anyone, including my own children, who likes to be read to any more than you.
I do like to be read to, with the occasional exception of listening to some of those ill-prepared essays and tutorials, the ones that drone on and on with little research and no creativity. But speaking of stories, it seems to me that there is too little of what we really like in stories, and I have been thinking that we simply must attempt to write some ourselves, stories like your Hobbit.
This is an intriguing idea. I think it is a tragedy that fairy tales have been, well, relegated as trivial stories for children. That is an injustice for both fairy tales and children. Why, we both know that stories carry so much more meaning. They are ideal in communicating ultimate truths.
I couldn't agree more, and the sad thing is that too much of what is being written these days is so linear, so aimed at disseminating facts and figures, and in doing so misses the subtle nuance of what matters most.
Precisely. It gets back to that notion of myth. It is at its best when it is presented as, well, from a poet who expresses truth metaphorically rather than in explicit details and descriptions. I fancy the writer who gives us incarnate descriptions of the world and its history. Someone like the author of Beowulf. I myself think that this is precisely what this generation needs, more writing that creates a myth of England that goes as far back as Arthur or even further.
The truth is, Tollers, if we wait for someone else to do that, it will never happen. I think we get started. What do you think?
Scene 23, the rabbit room. Clarke is smoking in front of the rabbit room's fireplace.
From that day on, Jack and Toller seemed more intentional with their writings. Jack was much more prodigious in getting things in print. His style was accommodating to that. He could write fast and furiously without the need for a rewrite. Tollers, on the other hand, had a pedantic style, exaggerating by his extreme need for preciseness. He never offered anything up for publication without several rewrites. Just as, or even more troubling for Tollers, was the fact that Jack was becoming popular due to his many publications. And it wasn't so much the number of publications that Tollers was jealous of, it was the nature of Jack's works that made him uneasy. You see, Jack's writing had become more and more expressions of his faith. Tollers felt like, well, he felt like that was inappropriate. That religious writing should be done by those trained in the religious community, theologians and clergy. And he wasn't the only one who felt that way. The academic community in Oxford had strong sentiments in that regard. Thus, the more popularity of Lewis's works grew, the more criticism he received from Tollers and the Oxford Dons. And Jack was becoming popular. Much of his popularity came from the fact that he was able to do a series on the BBC They ask him to talk about religion to bolster the country's courage.
Scene 24. BBC headquarters, London. Jack is in a room with a table and microphone. He's looking intently for the direction of the producer. He nods as if understanding that he is ready to begin.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is C.S. Lewis, broadcasting from the BBC studios in London. I have been asked to give a series of talks on the proper behavior. And at the outset, I must admit that I am not a preacher or a theologian. I am a mere Christian whose expertise in behavior comes as much from my personal failures as my successes. Nevertheless, I hope that these thoughts might help all of us in the living of these days.
Scene 25. The rabbit room. Clarke is at his table.
Jack's talks were very well received. In time, his voice became as well known as Prime Minister Churchill's. But this popularity did have its drawbacks. For one thing, his colleagues at the university became more and more incensed over his forays into religion. Secondly, letters from admiring supporters and caustic critics started arriving. It would have been easier if Jack had just ignored the letters, but he felt compelled, mind you, to write to every single person who wrote one.
Scene 26. Jack's study. Warnie is at Jack's desk, hunkered down over a typewriter, typing feverishly. Jack is in a reading chair, opening letters from a large stack of mail. He answers some of the mail by writing back on the letter itself. For others, he creates a pile that eventually ends up with Warnie.
Jack, I think it is admirable for you to want to answer all of these letters, but it's also a bit daft, if you don't mind my saying so.
Warnie, you could very well be right, but I feel as if it is my responsibility to do so, and please know how grateful I am for your willingness to help.
I don't mind. However, I might be making a bigger dent in the supply if we didn't have to keep answering some of the dimwits who feel as though they have the right to criticize you in any fashion they choose.
I look at it as a little game. I listen to their thoughts and try to honestly respond while seeking to suck some of the venom out of their complaints.
Oh, Jack, you and your games.
Scene 27. Toller's bedroom. The Tolkiens are getting ready for bed. Edith is at her vanity, brushing out her hair, and Toller's is in a chair reading a manuscript.
Ronald, did you hear your Mr. Lewis on the radio this afternoon?
No, Edith, I was at the college working. Jack should have been there too.
Was there a required meeting?
No, but Jack should spend more time with his work, I think.
Don't you think that his war effort is important work?
I just think Jack should be the one speaking for religion.
I don't know why you say that. What he said was quite good. Better, in fact, than most of the priests and ministers I've heard. And he does it in a matter of 15 minutes.
That's not what I'm talking about. There is no way he can handle some of these issues in 15 minutes. Experts in those areas have invested their lives in those subjects and have written volumes on the subjects.
Well, maybe those so-called experts might learn a thing or two from him. He can say more in a few minutes than any long-winded homily or lecture. Besides that, he doesn't claim to be a theologian. I've heard him several times now, and he's always careful to point out that he's not trained, but a mere Christian.
Real Christians should not be on the radio expounding Christian ethics, but professionals in that discipline should be the ones speaking.
But that is why he's so good. He doesn't claim to be highbrow when it comes to religion, and he speaks in common terms, as if we were simply sharing a meal together. Compared to some of the so-called professionals, I can understand what he's saying. I don't need some kind of dictionary so that I can look up words that I don't comprehend.
Jack is a most polished speaker, I'll give you that. But form without substance can be deadly.
Ronald, surely you don't think he is without substance.
Jack has a brilliant mind, but it has been trained for the 16th century literature, not religion.
So, he should not venture forth in anything other than his narrow field. He should be confined to this time and place in history? Can he not dabble in religion or fairy tales or anything else?
You know what I'm saying, Edith.
I think I do. I just don't agree with you. I find your friend to be the most lucid in talking about things that matter.
Edith walks away with Toller's eyes following her.
Good night, Ronald.
Good night, Edith.
Scene 28. Eastgate dining room. Jack and Tollers are at their accustomed table.
Jack, did you read how some of your religious friends described you in the Daily Telegraph?
No, you know I rarely read the newspapers.
Well, they spoke of you as the ascetic Mr. Lewis.
Why would anyone say that?
Well, I'm not sure, but I am tempted to respond with a letter to the editor saying, ascetic, you say? Mr. Lewis put away 3 pints in a very short session we had this morning, and he said he was going short for Lent.
Enough of the newspaper rubbish. How are you coming with your new Hobbit adventure?
I'm afraid I've hit another snag. I haven't been able to write anything of note as of late. I guess I've got the block, the dreaded writer's block.
Come on, Tollers, you can do better than that.
I really am stymied, Jack. I reread a section that I've written and am horrified at how it doesn't come together. So I start to rewrite, but that makes me have to rewrite everything that led up to that section.
Blast it all, Tollers, it is high time you stop rewriting what you already have. I know for a fact that you've rewritten most of it several times now. Your perfectionism is killing you. Maybe it's just your way of never letting go of your baby, of never exposing your creation to the greater community. You are wasting your time going over it incessantly.
Is that so? Well, I could never write like you do, whipping out books on first draft. I know for a fact you've sent some of your work into publication without even one correction in the margin. What kind of responsible writing is that? Well, perhaps a bit of my perfectionism wouldn't be so bad for you, to slow you down and think through things a bit more.
I didn't know you felt that way, Tollers.
I'm sorry to have to say it, Jack, but I, for one, worry that your haste in writing is simply to win the approval of the religious crowd.
Do you think that is what I am doing?
Aren't you?
I don't consider that to be the case. When I come home late at night and take up the pen, I'm simply trying to let the muse in me, spiritual as it may be, have the freedom to express himself.
Do you think you may be playing games with yourself? And with me, I think you know exactly what you are doing.
I have to admit I'm surprised by that. Of all people, I would think that you would know what I am doing and applaud it. There are things we are called to say in our writings sometimes, whether we intend to or not.
But, Jack, religious writing is not our business. We are Oxford Dons, for goodness sake, and no Oxford Don should be dabbling outside his given discipline.
But Tollers, you are the one who inspired me with the notion of how important fantasy is in teaching the meaning of ultimate reality. We're talking about more than mere academic discipline here. We're talking about our callings.
I have to say, I'm sorry about that. I find it sadly ironic that I, the one who invested so much time in seeking to convince you of the importance of religion, now need to criticize you for it. Jack, you know how I feel about matters of the church. They should be addressed by the church and not by a scholar of medieval literature.
I'm sorry you feel that way, and I'm sorry I've upset you so.
So am I, Jack.
Scene 29, the rabbit room.
The chill of that conversation was a harbinger of things to come. Jack and Tollers continued to meet, but the intimacy of their friendship began to show signs of strain. As sometimes happens in a friendship, the thing that pulled them together in the first place, the power of imaginative writing, was never enough to sustain the intensity of their relationship. I mean, in the beginning, friends are so taken by the fact that someone else shares their passion about a subject that it is more than enough to transcend their differences. As Jack once put it, friends walking side by side, focused on something else, paying little attention to anything else, pay little attention to anything else. However, when the object shifts, a sideways glance pulls the difference of the other into the equation. And Jack and Tollers were quite different. Different personalities, different views on faith, different ways in which they wrote. All of those things didn't matter so much in the beginning, but now the differences were becoming more and more distancing.